Hi everyone, welcome to the Sew Essential vlog. I'm Lucy and I'm here today to show you how to understitch. So understitching is one of the most important steps in the making of any garment, and it's used to prevent the facing or the lining that you're using to finish a raw edge on your garment from rolling to the right side. So it's meant to sit nice and neatly inside, and understitching will help it to do that. If you skip this step, you might end up with the lining or the facing coming to the right side of your garment, and that will just look messy and spoil all your hard earned efforts. So I just want to show you an example on a dress that I made. So this is the inside of the dress. I'm just showing you the neckline facing. So this was the way the neckline of the dress was finished, and can you just see that little neat line of stitches there close to the edge of the facing? This is the facing here. That is what understitching is, and as I said, it just prevents that facing from rolling to the right side of the garment, which we don't want because that won't look very neat. Everything I use today in the video is available on our site, and you can find the link to our site below. But now let's get started with some sewing. So here I've got an example of a garment. So I've got an armhole, and this is the main fabric, and then underneath we've got the lining fabric. They're right sides together, so I'm just going to stitch the armhole curve in the normal way with the normal seam allowance. So it's a 5/8 seam. I'm just going to reverse stitch at the start as you would, and I'm using my seam marker foot so that I can get a nice even seam around this curve, because it can be quite tricky sewing round a curve. I always used to find it really difficult when I first started sewing, and using a seam marker foot like this one really helped me. You can get these for lots of different makes and model of machine. We stock them on our site. And then also what I like to do when I'm going around a curve as well is use my needle up down on my machine. So if I press that button, whenever I take my foot off the foot control, the needle will stop in the down position, and then I can just manoeuvre the fabric like I have been doing around the curve here, and just straighten things up so that the edge of the fabric is lined up with the edge of the foot, which is my 5/8 marking, and it just helps me to get a really lovely even curve round that curved edge. And that's something that I used to just find really difficult when I first started sewing, as I say, but these couple of tips make life a lot easier for me. So I'm just coming to the end of the seam now. I'm just going to reverse stitch to secure all of that, and then we'll cut the threads, and there you have it. So we've got the main fabric and the lining fabric sewn together, right sides together. And then I've taken that fabric and I'm just going to trim those seam allowances in half. So I'm cutting both of them down by half. So just doing that nice and gently around the curve there. So I'm trimming the lining and the main fabric at the same time. You just need to manoeuvre things around a bit sometimes to do this. Obviously it's a little bit awkward sometimes doing it on camera, but I'm sure we'll get there. So we'll just move that out of the way. Now what I want to do now is trim one of those seam allowances in half again. So I'm just going to trim the cotton lining in half again. So it's a little bit fiddly at the start here, and I'm going to use my small scissors because those large scissors would be quite difficult to manoeuvre on this narrow strip of fabric. But once you get going, it's pretty easy. But you just need to be really careful, obviously, whenever you're trimming and grading seams. It's always worth just taking your time and being careful. I've had some unfortunate mishaps when doing this task in the past. So I'm just trimming right round there. So I'm not trimming the main garment fabric, just the lining. And then we come into the end here, just cut that off. So you can just see the main fabric now poking out from under the lining fabric here. And then what we're going to do now is clip that curve. So we're just going to snip to the seam line, not through it, so you've got to be really, really careful here. Again, I have learnt from experience here. And you probably want to do it about every half an inch, just clip to that seam line. And again, just take your time, just try and do it relatively evenly, and just make sure you're getting nice and close to the seam line but not going through it, because that will result in a hole in your garment, which we definitely don't want. So I'm just clipping all the way around the curve there. It's only really necessary to do this in the curved areas, and we're just coming to the end there. And what this allows you to do is it's going to allow you to manoeuvre the fabric. So you can see here I can manoeuvre that now into a straight line. So when I'm understitching, it's going to enable me to stitch nice and evenly across the fabric. So I'm bringing it over to the sewing machine here, and you can see there the clipped, trimmed and graded seams. Now what we're going to do is open that fabric out, and we're going to push the seam allowances towards the lining fabric, because you want to stitch the seam allowances to the lining or the facing on your garment, because if you remember, these stitches are going to sit inside the garment and they're going to keep the lining inside the garment. Now I'm just changing foot here. I'm going to use my clear foot because I just like to be able to see what I'm doing there, but I need to make sure I choose a marking on this foot so that I'm stitching an equal distance away from the seam line. But you can see there I've got the fabric ready, and I'm just bringing it under, bringing that seam allowance under the lining, because again we want to stitch it down to the lining, not to the main garment fabric. And I'm just going to make sure I've got a marker on my foot that I'm going to use so that I'm stitching an equal distance away from the seam line all the way around, because although this is going to sit inside the garment, it will be visible, this line of stitching. If you remember on the garment I showed you at the start of the video, it is visible, so you want it to be nice and neat and even and an equal distance away from that seam line. So I'm just reverse stitching to secure everything. And while you sew as well, you want to just gently pull the fabric, gently pull it, not with any real force, and that just encourages everything to sit nicely again. And then you just need to make sure periodically while you're sewing this, just check that your seam allowances are still tucked underneath the right side. You know, they might wriggle about a bit, they might end up going awry or going under the main fabric, so just check that they're sitting nicely underneath the lining or the facing. And I'm using a contrasting thread so you can see the stitches, but I'm stitching probably an 1/8, maybe even a 1/16 of an inch away from the seam, so I'm stitching nice and close to that seam. And as I work my way down, again just taking my time, making sure everything's still in the correct position, gently pulling the fabric apart, but very, very gently. And it's worth mentioning here, when you're doing this on a real garment and it's on a neckline or an armhole, you may not be able to get all the way to the end, and in those cases you just go as far as you can go and then secure it. You know, you might not be able to go right to the end, but that's perfectly fine and normal even in ready to wear and professionally made garments. So you can see that there's the lining, nice and neatly stitched. I've gone right up to the end on that, and I'll just show you here. So that's inside the garment, that's along the lining, and then if you look inside the garment, what you'll see is 2 lines of stitches. You'll see 1 line of stitches which is your understitching, and 1 line of stitches which is your main seam. And then just turn it to the inside, give it a quick press, and hey presto. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. As I mentioned at the start of the video, everything I used is available on our site. You can find the link to our website below. And if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, because you'll find lots more tutorials, regular updates on new sewing patterns, new dressmaking fabrics, what we've been making, and also reviews on our channel. So make sure you subscribe for more sewing goodness, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.